This is the Rise Up See Red podcast, all about the Arizona Cardinals and the NFL, featuring insider and outsider perspectives. Enjoy the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Now here are your hosts, Jess Root and Seth Cox.
Hello, Arizona Cardinals fans, and welcome to the latest edition to the Rise Up See Red podcast. I'm your host, Jess Root from CardsWire.com, the NFL wire site for the USA Today family of sites. My co-host is Seth Cox from RevengeOfTheBirds.com, SB Nation's Arizona Cardinals site. And episode 255 is what we have on deck tonight, recording on a Tuesday night. It's a little less Cardinals-centric than normal, as the Cardinals are now in the offseason, and nothing has really happened. We're in the middle of the NFL playoffs. We had the first round, the wild card round, with quite a few surprises. And so, in this edition of the show, we're going to react to the playoff games that happened over the weekend and look ahead to the divisional round. As well, we still got to talk football. There's some football going on. One of the players there was a player who stood out in Wild Card Weekend, and we're going to talk about, did the Cardinals miss out? Did the Cardinals make the wrong pick? Wade Phillips, now a free agent. Could he possibly end up on the Cardinals staff in some sort of form? We'll talk about the new coaches in the league. The Cardinals are going to face 4 of these new coaches in the next season, react to those moves. And then kind of the one other Cardinals thing we'll discuss is something that came out from ESPN about the performance of offensive lines. We'll discuss, was their offensive line good or bad? Because it seems like we hear both sides of it. So that's what's coming up on this edition of the show. Seth, first of all, how was watching the playoffs without any real rooting interest other than, it's a bummer that the Cardinals aren't in it. But of course they're not, because they weren't any good.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. The perfect weekend was so close because, the Patriots lost and then the Seahawks were close to losing. So, that was the one thing we were rooting for. So now we got to be Vikings and Packers fans this week, which is odd, but it is what it is to root against the NFC West, right?
That's true.
And then everybody's always happy whenever the Patriots lose, except Patriots fans.
And I'll be honest, I'm kind of in the minority in that sense, because as I've gotten older and less drastic as a fan, I honestly like the dynasties, and if the Cardinals can't be in it, I was rooting for Tom Brady to get that 7th ring and 10th Super Bowl, because I don't think I'll ever see that again, and I can say that I see it. Same thing with Alabama. I like it. As bad as it sounds, sorry guys, I'm an ASU fan, but when it came to the championship, I would have liked to have seen Oklahoma. I didn't want them in the playoffs based on their season, but I wouldn't have minded seeing Alabama again winning again. It is fun the potential of having LSU win it, because they haven't done it, but I kind of like to see greatness. And for me, this is a transition year, because we are seeing some of the greatest quarterbacks show some mortality. And the question is, with the Patriots losing and the Saints losing, and to be honest, when people asked me over the weekend who I thought was going to win the Super Bowl, I'm like, the Patriots. And then the Patriots lost, and then who do you think now? I'm like, the Saints. The Saints go down. Did we just see the end of perhaps one of the greatest quarterback eras that we've seen? Because Peyton Manning's retired, Brett Favre's retired, Kurt Warner's in the Hall of Fame, and now Tom Brady and Drew Brees. Have we seen the end of what perhaps is the golden age of top quarterbacks?
Yeah, I mean, it does feel like it at this point, that you're now coming to the point where it's just simply the younger guys are taking over. I mean, you look at this weekend, Tom Brady, that's a game that he wins, 9.9 times out of 10 at home, kind of ugly weather, not a lot of passing yards. Like, that's a game that Tom Brady pulls out some way, somehow. It didn't happen. Drew Brees has had a lot of very human moments in the last couple years, even going back to the hugely controversial call that got the terrible rule change in the NFL that then never works. You still have the fact that the undeniable truth was Drew Brees was late on the throw. Like if he would have seen it sooner, they walk into the end zone and there's no controversy. But so, I mean, it sucks to kind of see the end of what we presume will be or may be the end of these kind of historic Hall of Fame careers. We're talking about the number 1 and number 2 all time in touchdown passes, both hanging it up at this point, or maybe not hanging it up, but potentially moving on from the teams that they're known for. That's crazy to even think about.
It's odd in it for a couple of reasons. One, we just never could count out the Patriots, and you always just assume that they're going to move on. But then they lose to the Dolphins in Week 17. Tom Brady with the pick 6, and then he has a pick 6. What was it? The first time in his career he had pick 6s in consecutive games. That is a crazy stat. I think that's the stat that I remember hearing at the end of that game. That was the first time in his entire career that he had pick 6s in consecutive games, and the fact that they managed to lose a game in which Ryan Tannehill threw for 72 yards. Now Derrick Henry was otherworldly, but I was talking to you off the air about this. It is so rare. And we were spoiled by it. It's so rare for quarterbacks to go out on top. Steve Young's career, it was cut short by a concussion. He sort of he had to hang it up. Troy Aikman didn't get to have the crowning moment at the end of his career. Kurt Warner was tossed like a rag doll. We remember in that game against the Saints. John Elway got to win it in his last game. Peyton Manning did as well. But what we all remember as well that those teams, those Super Bowls were not won by the arms or the shoulders or the legs of their quarterbacks. They just happened to be there for the ride. But Brett Favre, his final year was disastrous. And it tends to be, well, I mean, look at Carson Palmer. He breaks his arm halfway through the season. It's like so many very good to great quarterbacks, their careers end on a whimper. Eli Manning this year, we don't know what the future has, but I mean, he got benched and played as a backup and admitted, hey, it wasn't fun. So as much as we think maybe that we can't count out Tom Brady, but this is exactly the way that great quarterback careers end. They just sort of fade off quietly, and we end up forgetting about it because we remember the greatness, but it's almost never a good way to go.
No, and you talked about it. You have Elway and you have Manning, and those guys were kind of carried to Super Bowls. And then you think about the other guys. You think about the guys that got close and then came back again. And you have, Brett Favre. You have obviously Kurt Warner, and Warner at least had another really good regular season, but he was left a battered man in the playoffs. A lot of these guys, and it's hard because they're competitors and they think they still have the same juice. And the reality is that it's hard to maintain that for as long as these guys have. And so, with Tom Brady, I'm never going to count him out because he's done things that nobody else has ever done. Drew Brees too, for that matter. I mean, just from the instance of the records they've broken, but from a logical standpoint, it wouldn't be surprising if these guys were not competitive again in terms of, or having their teams competitive again, because it is just so hard to maintain that level of play or two, it's so hard to have a team like that 98 Broncos team or that 15 Broncos team. I guess it's just the Broncos, but yeah, the 15 Broncos team to, kind of have the entire thing in place to carry an older quarterback to the promised land one last time.
As we look at the individual games, Bills Texans, you couldn't understand what was going on because the Bills looked like they were rolling in the first half, and then things fell apart. It was like Josh Allen, after he was playing well in the first half, decided I'm gonna be like Deshaun and start doing things that Josh Allen does and missing passes and making some poor decisions. And then we've seen some really great things from Deshaun Watson, but he kind of reminds me in this sense, in terms of the gamer that he is. He is a better Vince Young, right? Because he's got the numbers. I mean, he's putting up crazy numbers, and it looks like he's got some longevity to him without the mental side that was the issue. But he can, for as much as we wonder about Bill O'Brien, and that's, you wonder why he still has a job, but when you get a guy like Deshaun Watson who literally just wills his team to win, wouldn't he be better suited on a different team than that Texans team?
Well, that's we talk about it on the air. The Texans are entering that bizarro Jason Garrett, Jeff Fisher zone with their coach, where it's clear that there's a better answer to the coaching position available. It's just not clear when you can make the move, because how do you fire the guy that's won 3 of the last 4 AFC South titles, or 2 of the last 3, whatever it is, and has got his team to the playoffs in 2 consecutive. How do you just fire that guy, especially when your history is the Houston Texans? I mean, that'd be like the Arizona Cardinals firing BA he in 2016 they made the wild card, and then 2017 they just made the wild card again. When it's the best run of your history, it's hard to say, hey, we can upgrade from that, because the reality is, while it definitely can get better, we all know it can get so much worse.
Definitely.
And you can, ask the Philadelphia Eagles. It was the perpetual, it's Andy Reid, it's Andy Reid, it's Andy Reid. And so then finally they got rid of Reid and they brought in Chip Kelly, and it was like, this is different. And then they had one nice season with Chip Kelly, and then it was like, oh crap. And so
Andy Reid goes on to continue to win.
Right. And then, you could say the same thing about the 49ers and Jim Harbaugh. Sometimes when there is that drop off or that stagnation, I liken it to kind of the Bob Melvin Diamondbacks, right? They were never really contenders, but they were always in contention, if that made sense.
Yes.
They were never going to win a World Series. Teams were never like, oh crap, Diamondbacks are going to make a run in the postseason. It was always like, oh, the Diamondbacks made the playoffs, or oh, the Diamondbacks, fell 3 games short. But then you have to look at it and you go, okay, well, so what's better than Bob Melvin? And so, and then you're like, oh, this is definitely not better than Bob Melvin. What were we thinking? And then the A's were like, you know what? We'll take that. We'll take right around 500 every year, and every 2 years make the playoffs and just be there, because it's a lot better than the alternative of 12,000 people in your stadium.
That's true. What about that? We talked a little bit about the Patriots-Titans game. Are we seeing, perhaps, in an analytics-driven NFL where passing the ball is really the proven method to win, we're seeing teams like the Baltimore Ravens run the ball with high level of success, and it's really the base of their offense. The Cardinals on the kind of the low end, Seattle, if we look at the last few years, their offense has always been built around the running game first. When you have it, are we seeing a comeback, maybe at a small level, of smash mouth, run the ball football with the performance like Derrick Henry's 182 yards on the ground and pretty much all of their offense? What is it? He had 182 yards on the ground. He had another 22-yard catch. So he had over 200 yards of offense of their 272 total yards. And against, honestly, I mean, goodness, like the Patriots defense was number one.
Well, and that's the hard thing that I always go with is, well, I think analytics are fantastic, and they definitely have their place. There's also a flow to the game. I'm going to see if I can find the text messages with some of the scouts I talked to, and it was just basically that was what it is it talks about not being able, like, in the flow of the game, there is this idea that, okay, so X is not working, let's use Y, even if X is the way to go. And so, for a lot of that, it's just about understanding where the flow of the game is. And Tannehill wasn't really having a lot of success, and they were kind of imposing their will with Derrick Henry. And so it worked. And so it's kind of like it's basically the momentum argument, if you will. I don't know how many people follow that crap online, but there's this big argument that momentum is not real. And while the idea of momentum may not be real, there's definitely like this idea of, oh, things are starting to go our way and playing better in that moment. And so I just think a lot of it has to do with what is going on in the game and how the game is progressing before you go completely like, hey, analytics is the way. Analytics are great for things like, at this juncture, should we go for it on fourth down? Like, what are the percentages telling us? But at the same time, it's easy to say this is what the analytics say, and then you go, oh, crap, this is the 2018 Arizona Cardinals offense. No, we can't go for it on 4th and 1 from our own, 38, because we're probably not going to get a yard, and we can't kick a 55-yard field goal because Phil Dawson's still hurting. So yeah, let's just punt. You know what I'm saying? Like you have to take into consideration everything. And so while analytics are great, I think there's always going to be a place for just understanding the flow of the game and letting the game dictate what you do much more than anything else.
Dan Bickley one time on the radio kind of talked about, and this came, I think it was against the Seahawks after that game, when the Cardinals went for it on 4th down, and Max Williams, I can't remember which game it was, but Max Williams was wide open.
Oh, that was the Tampa Bay game. Yeah. Tampa
Bay. So he just wide open, drops a pass on 4th down, and it was a turnover and downs instead of probably a touchdown. And Bickley said it is the right. I liked the way he put it. He says analytics are great, but the one thing that analytics fails at is it fails to factor in the human part of things. Like, okay, if it's 4th and 1 and there's a big play, you really should get the ball into your biggest playmakers like a Larry Fitzgerald, Christian Kirk, or even at the time David Johnson, as opposed to a Max Williams, because that because there are because it doesn't come into fact. It kind of analytics kind of takes away the notion that the best players come up the biggest in the biggest moments. That's not an analytics view. And so, while the play design was great and Max Williams was wide open and Kyler Murray made a perfect throw, the fact that it wasn't Larry Fitzgerald or one of these other guys, Max Williams, he lost it in the sun and he dropped it. He just missed the pass, missed the catch. That's not a knock on Max Williams, who's a quality tight end, but in certain scenarios, you just simply want to go with the standard football move and get the ball to your best player. And I think Cliff Kingsbury did a really good job of that this year. Is analytics talks about spreading the field in the passing game, and they just weren't doing that well. And when they discovered that the running game was what was the best, they built it around that. And they still threw the ball a lot. I mean, look at the passing attempt numbers for Kyler Murray. But it's interesting to see how we're seeing over the last few years, we've kind of seen a renaissance back to the running back, although paying the running back still kind of whether that works out. The other playoff games, can you believe that despite the whining and complaining that Sean Payton did to get that rule changed, that their game would end with what probably should have been a pass interference call?
Yeah, it's always ironic when you complain to get the rules changed and then it bites you in the butt again. So, but that's just how football works. There's, whether it's momentum or other things, like I'm a big believer in kind of the idea of the ball doesn't lie, and it's going to find a way to give the team that is better the win. And so whether or not I agreed with how last year ended, it didn't call for a complete overhaul of things. And the fact that it happened and then they still couldn't get it done, even with, even at home against the Vikings, it was ironic. And it's ironic that they've done that twice now at home.
Well, it is, I will say, as much as Kirk Cousins can be in some ways an unlikable guy with how things happened in Washington and the fact that he hasn't been able to, but he finally proved that he can come up big in big moments. I mean, what is it? His only second playoff game ever. He already kind of had the same rap that Carson Palmer had, that he came up small in big games. Palmer was injured in one, played poorly in another, and finally got that first playoff win against the Packers when he really didn't play well. But Cousins finally gets kind of the monkey off his back. It'll be interesting to see what happens moving forward. Is obviously the Seahawks move on, because here's the thing of the weekend: 3 of the 4 wild card teams won, and now they become much bigger underdogs against the top 2 seeds. What are you looking for? How do you see this next weekend playing out? So you've got Vikings, 49ers, you've got Titans, Ravens, Texans, Chiefs, and Seahawks, Packers. Do you see any of these underdog teams having a real chance of knocking off the home team?
No, not really. You can never, in the playoffs, you never really count out anybody, but I would take chalk all weekend. I think we're going to end up Chiefs at Ravens and Packers at 49ers in the championship game. The Seahawks could definitely beat the Packers. I just don't trust them enough to show up in 3 straight big games.
They are really good in these close games, but the fact that they just keep having injuries happen and their defense overall is not what it used to be, and the fact that they're relying on Marshawn Lynch again. The Vikings are a team that I'm really interested in seeing, because they do have the potential to. I think they are the one team. Actually, the 2 NFC games, I don't know which way they're going. I could totally see any of those games going, either of those games going either way. I'm kind of done doubting the 49ers, but they didn't finish strong down the stretch. The Vikings have the ability with their balanced kind of offense, because they have the threats in the passing game. They have a very good running back, and they have a defense that can stop San Francisco. And then the Packers are a tough team to trust because they just never were dominant all year and struggled against some bad teams.
Yeah, and that's the thing is, like, it's hard to pick against the home teams in the NFC in these games because, one, Minnesota's got to go all the way to San Francisco. It's outdoors. I didn't really look at the weather, to be completely honest. And then in Green Bay, it's Lambeau in January. Like, that's always the hard thing for me, is picking against home teams in January. I really hope the Vikings win. I don't want to see any success from any of these NFC West teams. So, but
in the AFC, it's. I mean, I could see Texans Chiefs being a barn burner because Deshaun Watson really, really, really wants to be Patrick Mahomes. So that will be fun. But we all want to see Ravens.
I think we want to see Chiefs at
and
Ravens.
Everyone deserves Ravens Chiefs. So let's just make sure that happens.
Yeah, and I mean, San Francisco's weather, it could rain on, or they play on Sunday, huh? Never mind. I mean, it still could rain, but it'll only be 54 during the game. So, I mean, unless it rains, if it's a game where Kirk can throw the ball, I mean, it's going to come down, really what it's going to come down to is can Kirk throw the ball well enough to beat San Francisco? Because I don't think San Francisco is going to really rely on Jimmy to beat that really good Vikings defense. And so I think for me, that's where it's going to come down to, is what can Kirk do against, what is a great 49ers defense. I mean, Kirk Cousins is no Kyler Murray, let's be honest.
Definitely not. Coming out to the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We're going to move on to a different topic, as we're going to talk about a player we didn't even bring up, and that's a player that the Cardinals perhaps missed out on in the draft. That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We barely talked about the Seattle game, but here's the thing. DK Metcalf, 160 receiving yards and a touchdown, 58 catches, 900 yards on the season as a rookie. And he was an interesting player coming into the draft because most thought he was solid a first rounder, then he fell to the late second round. The question now that a lot of fans are asking is, did the Cardinals screw it up? Because 2 picks before DK Metcalf, they took Andy Isabella. Do you think the Cardinals are going to lament that pick for years?
So we talked about this a lot on our little group text that I have, and one of the things from the time Metcalf was drafted is that Metcalf is a great fit in Seattle with what Seattle wants to do. You talked about it a little bit with, they still really focus with Schottenheimer on running the ball. And when you look at this, so I got a text from 8/29, so this August 29th, and we were talking about Metcalf in the preseason, and the one guy said this. He said he's the type of guy that will thrive with Russell, though, because of 2 things. Russell Wilson trusts guys immensely. I don't know if Kyler Murray would have done that in year 1. And 2, they were able to bring along Metcalf in a way that, quite frankly, the Cardinals wouldn't have been able to this year, and that was having him kind of be a decoy for a lot of the game, running a lot of vertical routes, and then being able to use that running game and play action to set up deep shots down the field to him. And again, Russell Wilson was throwing a lot of deep throws to Metcalf into coverage and then on wide open throws because it had been set up, would have been set up, throughout the game. I just don't know if that would have fit in Arizona. Now, that's not to say he wouldn't have probably done more than Andy Isabella did this year. However, when you talk about kind of fit with teams and what teams need, the Cardinals really got DK Metcalf of their own in round 4 with Hakeem Butler. So I think for that, it's that tough conversation of, the guy got hurt that was supposed to be their DK Metcalf. How much would Metcalf have added to this offense? He probably would have played in place of Damiere Byrd, right? As that kind of deep threat and then single coverage slant guy. But for the most part, I don't think I wouldn't have been shocked if his production was less than half of what he had in Seattle, because a lot of times it's all about where a guy lands as opposed to how much how talented they are. There are transcendent talents, but there's also guys that have to get into the right spot to have an early impact, like Metcalf has.
And there were things that were worried, obviously, since he was a late second-round pick. Literally every team passed him. Every team passed on him. And he did have the huge boom or bust potential because he had the physical traits, he had the speed, but he had some injury issues. There were questions of his route running, and then of his ability to do more than straight line speed. So I understand the question, but the Cardinals needed all sorts of receiver help, and having a speed guy who can go up and get the football is a guy they still are missing right now on the roster, unless Hakeem Butler becomes that guy, and a guy that actually has a family connection to the team because his uncle and his grandfather both played for the Cardinals in previous years. Eric Metcalf played at the end of his career for the Cardinals, and his grandfather also played for the Cardinals. Terry Metcalf, decades ago, and so it seemed like a nice match. Now I'll get it. Isabella checked every box because in the offense that the Cardinals run, you want guys that can move well in short, small spaces. The problem was Isabella they saw as a slot receiver and thought he could be great in the slot, and they weren't looking for, apparently, that X receiver outside. And he had the speed, he had the production, he had the mentality, the durability. So he did make the perfect pick. And year 1, he was missing in action for a number of reasons because he didn't adjust to the slot well. And let's be honest, when you got Christian Kirk and Larry Fitzgerald, it's hard to find playing time. So they actually had to move him back outside. They still see him as a slot guy, so we'll see what's moving forward. But that will be this. I'm sure this is going to be a debate and kind of a sore spot for a lot of Cardinals fans if Metcalf continues to put up big numbers and Isabella doesn't become more than just a trick player.
Yeah, that's the thing is there's definitely no question that in year 1 the Cardinals made a bad pick. It just comes down to the fact that when you're grading the overall pick, you are looking at the full career of guys, and we can have the same discussion with other players, and that's kind of the fun thing is that Andy Isabella is the easy one because of, like you said, how well how well DK Metcalf played this year, but when you look at, picks like in last year, you had Christian Kirk as a wide receiver, and was he necessarily better than some of the players drafted after him? Michael Gallup, comes to mind right now. Or was he really a better pick than a guy like Orlando Brown, who's a Pro Bowl alternate right tackle in Baltimore? So again, everything will always come back to, in my opinion, fit more than anything. Like, again, there's transcendent talents. There are guys that just completely transcend anything, like a Quentin Nelson or a guy like Mike McGlinchey. Those are offensive linemen, obviously, but Vita Vea has played really well. But then you look at a guy like Denzel Ward, who had a really, really, really good rookie year and then got into Steve Wilkes' defense and kind of fell off a ledge. And you're like, oh, so that's what makes it difficult. I mean, he went from a Pro Bowler to a guy that, didn't nearly play as well this year. So it's just a lot of times guys get into the perfect situation to have success early. And so here's my question. And obviously, like I said, in year 3 or after year 3, so in 2022, yeah. So you and I will be having this conversation after the 2021 season, barring Isabella getting cut between now and then. But if Metcalf is a perennial 60, 800, 900 guy, and Isabella goes from 150 or whatever he was this year to 600 to 1200, like, what in that case, what is the difference? That's my question. Like, if it's a 3-year journey versus a 1-year journey where the plateau happens right away, and not saying that a 900-yard guy in round 2 is bad, but like, if that's his plateau, and you just reach your plateau faster, it only really matters if you're talking a team that's trying to compete, right?
That's absolutely true, and so it feels gross now. you look at DK's production, right. You look at Isabella's production, you're like, stupid. Why do we keep doing this? Why do we keep picking the wrong guy? When the truth is, and Cliff Kingsbury said it, they weren't disappointed in him. Like, everything publicly said they weren't disappointed in what he was doing. He was working hard. He didn't have his opportunities. If Larry Fitzgerald retires this offseason, Isabella is going to need to have a big role next year, because he will then likely fill in one of those slot spaces. Because if the Cardinals go out and find a receiver in free agency, a vet receiver, even a young receiver, they're probably looking on the outside, because you got Kirk, you got Isabella. They're probably going to try and bring back Pharaoh Cooper, at least on some sort of contract. And so Isabella will have his opportunity. I think he's kind of being handcuffed by Larry Fitzgerald still being around, and the Cardinals still want Fitz, and so it's fine.
Yeah, exactly.
Coming up on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We're actually going to change gears, talk a little bit about coaching staff, but not necessarily about. There are some coaching moves that we know of, sort of. But could the Cardinals land a big name on their defensive staff and have him not be defensive coordinator? That's coming next on Rise Up See Red. We're back on the Rise of See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. And one of the big stories from early in the week is the fact that the Los Angeles Rams have decided to move on from Wade Phillips as their defensive coordinator. He wasn't fired, but his contract is not being renewed. So his contract is up. He becomes a free agent. He's 72 years old. He's been a head coach or defensive coordinator since 1981. He's been in the league since 1976, which, and I'm not that young. He predates me. So he was coaching in the NFL before I existed. That's something. And I'm not old, but I'm definitely not young. I've got 2 adult children, so there's that. Here's the thing. The Cardinals have not announced anything, but one of the first coaching moves that was reported was defensive line Chris Acuff was let go. Now, a little bit of research I did Tuesday evening just to find out if there had been any movement on the coaching staff. And the Cardinals team side on their coaching roster has 5 guys from their staff that are no longer listed. Meaning, 1, they were fired. 2, they didn't have their contracts renewed. Or 3, there was a mutual parting of ways, perhaps because the coach had another opportunity that they want to pursue elsewhere. There's 2 defensive guys. There's defensive line coach Chris Acuff and defensive assistant Chris Wilson. Interestingly enough, Chris Wilson used to be a defensive line coach for the Philadelphia Eagles. Scott Bordeaux of the Athletics kind of put it out there, hey, that's a guy to watch because he's been a D-line coach before. Then the other guys there's an assistant wide receiver coach, Peter Badinovac. He's no longer listed. He was added this year. Assistant strength and conditioning coach Vernon Stevens, a guy I remember from Tecmo Super Bowl when he was with the Patriots as their running back. He was let go, or he's no longer listed on the coaching staff. And then assistant special teams coach Randall McCray, who was a holdover from Steve Wilkes' staff. Connecting the dots here. This is something I just threw out there. I'm not reporting anything. I'm not speculating anything. Just hear me out. At Wade Phillips' age, and the fact that he might not get a defensive coordinator job somewhere. He said on Twitter he wants to still coach and to contribute. The Cardinals have a situation where he would fit nicely because their defensive coordinator, Vance Joseph, is a Wade Phillips guy. He runs a Wade Phillips defense. He was mentored and brought along in the coaching ranks by Wade Phillips. Wade Phillips, way back in the 70s, the last time he was a position coach was a defensive line coach. He would make a perfect Tom Moore type guy for Vance Joseph, kind of like Tom Moore was for Bruce Arians, where you have his former mentor, the coordinator or coach's former mentor, now being a part of his staff, coming in. And I don't think there would be an ego problem. Wade Phillips, I think, would be more than happy to work with one of his former staffers, just like Billy Davis, Cardinals linebackers coach, has been a defensive coordinator before. In fact, he was Joseph's defensive coordinator in San Francisco, and the relationship works fine because they have mutual respect. They came up together. That's kind of a pipe dream. I respect the heck out of Wade Phillips and what he's done in the NFL, and maybe he's at the point in his career where he's not going to get the coordinator job. And what better place to go would be to work with one of your former staffers, stay on the West Coast, be able to coach against the team that didn't bring you back. What odds do you give that? Do you see that as even a possibility?
Yeah, I think it's always a possibility. There's just some small issues that they'll have to overcome. Obviously, one being what we'll get to in a second, the new coaching hires. There's always a chance that these, especially these last 2 hires that were kind of announced today, Tuesday, January 7th, that they could be asked to bring on either a veteran defensive coordinator or, like you said, like a Tom Moore type guy to be kind of a influence for a new head coach, first time NFL head coach at least. That's one, and then 2, you'll probably have a couple defensive coordinator openings that'll show up in the next month, whether it's playoff teams or guys that get fired late or something like that. So, it'll be interesting kind of to watch the whole situation unfold. I mean, from a career standpoint, he doesn't well, I mean, obviously, from the outside of a career standpoint, he doesn't need the money. Obviously, everybody's got issues somewhere, so who knows with Wade Phillips or anybody for that matter. But, when you look at it, it would be a good thing for the Cardinals to have somebody kind of help out with with where Vance Joseph's struggles are. Maybe is that the defensive line? Is he maybe just like a defensive, like what was Tom Moore's title? Assistant head coach, and
he was assistant head coach offense. But the truth was he was a quarterback's guy.
Yeah, and so can you do the same thing with Wade Phillips? Hey, you're the assistant head coach defense, and you're not the defense coordinator, but you're Vance's right hand man, so to speak. I think the only real negative that you can pull out of that potential thing is always going to be as Vance, you're always going to be worried that that Wade Phillips is now sitting there. So if the Cardinals start out 1-4 and they're averaging 35 points a game and giving up 39 points a game, it would, whether it be Cliff or Steve or Michael, would somebody get antsy, right? And be like, hey, we got this Hall of Famer sitting here. Let's let him call the games. You know what I'm saying? So I think that's the only from a just a logical logistics standpoint, I think that would be the one type of thing that could be the roadblock for a guy like Vance. Like you said, if everybody can put their egos away, or if Vance gets a reassurance, say hey, he's not here to take over your job in any way, shape, or form. You're going to have the full season, barring catastrophe through the first 8 weeks. You're going to have the full season to show us what you can do. I don't see it as being a problem. I just don't know. If that's where Wade is at this point in his career.
And that ultimately is the caveat. Is obviously he wants to coach, and I think his first choice would be, if not head coach, which he's not done great at in his stints previously, but also to be a coordinator. But then again, you get to be a certain age, and if you just want to contribute in some way, you just want to stick around in the league at 72. You don't have your shelf life is finite in this league, and that is about the age where you see some guys go from where the league moves on from them, but their coaching prowess still is valuable in different roles other than calling the games. I would love to see it. I have this. There's enough there. I mean, honestly, there's just enough. There are just enough connections there for me to think, it might happen. I'm not calling that it will happen, but how fun would that be to have him jump ship to this team and be able to help a defense, especially up front, because in particular, what do Wade Phillips defenses tend to be? They tend to be very tough up front. And now part of that is the personnel that they've had, because, you go from the Texans and having J.J. Watt to the Rams.
Aaron Donald, yeah.
And having Aaron Donald and Michael Brockers and Ndamukong Suh. It's good. So that is something I would love to see. I don't know if it'll happen, but I think I want to throw it out there. That's something maybe it's fun enough to pretend that it could happen, because it's not impossible, and there's enough connections to say, yeah, that's not too far out of reach.
Yeah, and so that's the thing is, until he's either retired or signed somewhere, there's always a nice possibility that it could be something that comes to fruition.
Coming up next on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. We're going to come back and talk about those new coaching hires that are around the league and the fact that the Cardinals are going to see many of them in 2020. That's coming up next on Rise Up See Red. Back on the Rise Up See Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. There are 4 new head coaches with jobs now. 4 teams have made their coaching decisions. The Cleveland Browns are still making the rounds for them, but as of right now, the Washington Redskins have made their coaching hire. The Dallas Cowboys have made their coaching hire. The Carolina Panthers have, and the New York Giants have. As you kind of notice, hey, all the NFC East except for the Eagles have new coaches. The Cardinals will face those 4 teams in 2020. It's interesting to see what's out there because the Redskins take the Panthers cast off and Ron Rivera. The Panthers, they go out and spend John Gruden money on Baylor's Matt Rule. 7 years, up to $70 million for a guy that's been at Baylor for 2 years and did some great work, but no NFL experience. The Dallas Cowboys bring back Mike McCarthy after they cut ties with Jason Garrett. Mike McCarthy, who got fired after the Cardinals beat the Packers in 2018. So there's that. And then the New York Giants with the surprise. They hire a guy you'd never heard of, Joe Judge, special teams coordinator and wide receivers coach for the New England Patriots. Now, which of those hirings was the least surprising to you or created the least amount of buzz for you?
I thought the Rivera hiring wasn't a surprise. It leaked really early, so it was basically seemed like it was coming from the beginning. I wasn't surprised to see that. Rivera is a extremely well-respected guy in the NFL. We had talked briefly once he was fired about the potential of him being the defense coordinator, and we kind of shot that down right away. So, I think they're building a very interesting old school staff in Washington. Ron Rivera as your head coach, Jack Del Rio as your defensive coordinator. Scott Turner's been around for a long time. So we'll see kind of how that goes. Then I think McCarthy in Dallas wasn't really a surprise either. Was anybody else even really? There was a bunch of names mentioned, but was anybody else even really mentioned for Dallas?
When Jerry Jones had McCarthy sleep over at his house,
right?
you know who was always really the favorite, and the other guys were just because you had to interview guys, and you always want to do your due diligence, but McCarthy was always the guy.
And so, those two weren't surprising. I don't think it was surprising to see Matt Rule get hired because that would insinuate that it was unexpected. I think what was unexpected was that he was going to become one of the 5 highest paid coaches in the NFL.
Right. And I don't know how true this is. On Cliff Kingsbury's Wikipedia page, I just saw this on Facebook. It says that he got a 5-year deal worth $10.5 million. Matt Rule, 7 years, $60 million up to 7. And that's crazy money, by the way, because remember how crazy everyone thought that the Raiders were for hiring John Gruden at 10 years, $100 million. Guess what? The Panthers just gave that amount of money. Not quite as many years, but that amount of money basically to a guy that never coached and never been an NFL head coach, much less been around the NFL or even won a Super Bowl at the NFL level. So that's crazy. That's clearly, to me, not the hiring, but the money and the commitment. Because normally when you get a guy with no experience, you get a guy like Kingsbury who's getting the $2 million a year salary. And the Cardinals still are paying, by the way, Steve Wilks. The amount that they're paying Steve Wilks and Cliff Kingsbury do not even equal anywhere near what, in fact, it's what they're paying them probably over the extent of their contracts might match 2 years of what Rule is getting. The funny thing is, what I find about this is the report that came out, that because it was sort of out there that the Giants were interested in Rule, and that supposedly Rule, after he got the offer from the Panthers, called the Giants back to see if they'd match the offer, which tells me he really wanted to coach the New York Giants. And the only reason why he took the Panthers job is because he couldn't turn down that crazy money, because guess what? It's not like NFL players. When coaches sign contracts, they get every penny of it.
And it is interesting. I mean, Rule's overall coaching record is 47-43, but we heard a lot about how Cliff Kingsbury was 35-40 in the Big 12. Well, Matt Rule was 19-20. So there you go. Right? I mean, he had an 11-3 season with Baylor, a 7-6 and a 1-11 season. So, I think Rule's a good coach. So I'm not surprised to see this. He's a young guy. He's from New York. That's his dream job. That's where he wanted to be. But maybe I would err on the side of that the Giants actually made the right decision to not overpay for a head coach that has, 2 winning seasons in the Big 12. But I do think Rule is a very good coach, if that makes sense. Like, I understand why the Giants didn't pony up, is what I'm trying to say. Like, I had, or I still have, my reservations about Cliff Kingsbury, but they took a swing at a guy at a reasonable rate. It's not like they paid Kingsbury 5 years, even $30 million. And so for Rule to get $60 million out of the gate is just, the Cardinals can basically hire 4 more head coaches before they get to that cost.
It's true. And here's the thing is we haven't seen since Jimmy Johnson a college coach without the NFL experience previous to come in and succeed. That we're talking since Jimmy Johnson in the 90s, and we've seen some great college head coach. We're not talking built up the bit. We're talking long established, proven head coach. Nick Saban, Steve Spurrier, guys like that have come in. Chip Kelly, who come in and ultimately, they fizzled out of the league when they were the top of the coaching pyramid at the college level. But like I told you off the air, what's hard about coaching hires is because you're taking the reaction overall when, if you look at most of the league, most coaching hirings don't really work out, because that's why teams are hiring and firing coaches every year. And I'm going to kind of take, like I said, with Vance Joseph, my belief in I do believe that coaching matters, but I don't think that there are significant difference-making head coaches out there in the NFL. It's more about the right guy in the right situation. I don't think most coaches, in fact, the grand majority of coaches, could go into any place and replicate the success that they've had somewhere else, because it's just how the NFL is. I don't think that most of the coaches are that. I don't think that there's that many coaches that are just that much smarter than the rest of the league, or that much better. They just have a better situation or have had a better run, and so I can't criticize the Giants for hiring a guy no one's ever heard of, and in Joe Judge, because guess what? The Rams did the exact same thing with Sean McVay, and it's worked out fabulously until this year, and their down year was 9-7. And so for every big name that's hired that doesn't work out, there's a little name that does work out. No one expected Mike Tomlin to be as great as successful or as John Harbaugh has been. But coaching success is fleeting, and most head coaches aren't great their first time around.
Exactly. And so when you look at this, entire thing, I don't think, and we'll end on this guy, obviously. I mean, McCarthy's getting his second chance in Dallas to kind of resurrect or kind of take the next step in that franchise. And then you get a guy like Joe Judge, who has basically come out of nowhere to get the chance to be the head coach at one of the, most proud franchises in the NFL. And he's taking over a situation which is extremely odd, in which their last 2 first-round picks have been a running back and a quarterback, and they've obviously they used a couple more first-round picks on defense after that. But when it's all said and done, it seemed like the team was being built around the identity of the GM and the head coach, and now you blow out the head coach and you still have to deal with those picks. But at the same time, how does a guy like Judge pass up that opportunity? Because it could be years before he gets another one, right?
Right, absolutely. You have to be super, super established or super confident in something else that'll come up to turn down one of the 32. Mind you, of all the thousands of coaching jobs in the world, there are only 32 head coaching jobs in the NFL. So even if you're not quite ready, you go and run with it, because you can always go back to your position coaching, take that head coaching money and run, and do the best that you can, build with what you're convicted in. And if it doesn't work out, it doesn't work out, because almost every single time that someone fizzles out as a head coach, there's still a place for them in the league as a position coach or a coordinator.
Well, and I look at it like this, you and I, in the year of Steve Wilkes, I think we both advocated the strongest if they weren't going to be able to get a Pat Shurmur type, which fizzled out in New York, ironically. I think both you and I were highest on Brian Flores. And because when you looked at the other candidates, a lot of the times what it comes down to is little things that you have to find. And with Flores, it was finding out about his personality in the room in New England, about his effect and what the players thought about him in New England in that linebacker room. Because remember, he was just a linebackers coach at that point.
Right.
He wasn't the defensive coordinator. He was just the linebackers coach. And so that's what intrigued us, was the turnaround of the linebackers under him. The fact that he had been a guy that came up as a scout, that he wasn't a coach from day one, that he was a guy that worked his way up through the scouting systems. So when you look at all of that, you say, hey, this is a guy that is intriguing. Whether or not he works out in Miami remains to be seen. But I think it would have been safe to say he probably would have had more success than what we saw from Steve Wilkes, who right now is completely out of a job. There was that rumor that he was going to be the DC under Ron Rivera in Washington, and Ron went with Jack Del Rio. So,
and Wilkes isn't even going over as anything. But then again, Wilkes is still getting paid by the Cardinals. So,
well, and now the Browns as well. So, so I mean, and we talked about that with players too. sometimes spot matters more than anything. Steve Wilkes was in a terrible spot. He was dealt a terrible hand here in Arizona. I will never, ever, ever disagree with that. At the same time, he went to, albeit a very toxic situation in Cleveland, but he also did not help the defense. The defense didn't get better. In fact, got worse with all of those, high draft picks. So again, it comes back to sometimes it's about where you take your shot, and then sometimes it's just about taking your shot and seeing where the chips fall.
Coming up next in the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. For the last segment, we're going to go back to the Cardinals and talk about some offensive line analytics and decide, well, was the offensive line good or was it not? Because it sounds like to some people it was good, and others it was terrible. That's coming up next on Rise Up Sea Red. We're back on the Rise Up Sea Red podcast, the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web, and we know that the offensive line gave up a lot of sacks. They were, I think, the third most. They gave up 50 sacks this year. I think 2 or 3 teams gave up more. But they were number 2 in yards per rushing attempt. And, surprise, surprise, there is a metric that says the Cardinals were one of the league's best at pass blocking. This is an ESPN metric, an ESPN analytics metric called pass blocking win rate, which is the rate at which that a unit or an individual player can sustain a pass block for at least 2.5 seconds. Believe it or not, the Cardinals were number 10 in the league in pass blocking wins. At win rate at 62% of the time, they were able to maintain and sustain those blocks for 2.5 seconds. And even more surprising is that short-armed A.Q. Shipley, the old man, was number 5 among all centers with a pass block win rate of 96%. Are we to think that that these numbers are hogwash? Especially when they give up 50 sacks? Or is this Cardinals offensive line actually good?
Well, I mean, I don't know how many people actually listen to this show. And by that, I don't mean download it. I mean actually listen to Jess and I talk for an hour. But this show has repeatedly said, whether we believe it or not, whether we agree with it or not, whether Pro Football Focus agrees with it or not, that the Cardinals like their offensive line, and they would like to have all 5 back in 2020. There's a reason we are telling you guys this, and it's not because of PFF or because there are metrics that we don't have access to that the team uses. And the team believes that not only is A.Q. Shipley a good center, the team believes that they progressed, and I think everybody would agree with that to an extent, but that they progressed from game 1 to game 16, and they became one of the better offensive line units in the NFL.
It's obvious, I know. And we know most people will look at the sack numbers and say, oh my gosh, that line is terrible. And in fact, fans are guilty of this too. As we look at kind of the debate that's going to happen for the next 3 months, 3.5 months leading up to the draft, there are staunchly two parties when it comes to the draft. And that's in round 1, draft a wide receiver, round 1, draft an offensive lineman. And at the same time, there's people that say upgrade from DJ Humphries, or the idea of re-signing DJ Humphries and AQ Shipley is stupid, and no wonder the Cardinals suck because they never get the. But look at this. This is not a metric. ESPN's not in the habit of creating things to make the Cardinals look good. So
right.
In terms of and I like this as a metric. This isn't a perfect. This metric isn't perfect, but if you sustain your block for 2.5 seconds, that's the time period where pretty much quarterbacks have gotten rid of the ball. When you've got a starting center who is doing his job and winning almost 100% of the time, that's incredible. And then the line as a unit, that's a top half. It's a top third even. And it makes sense considering you look at the offensive production, because bad offensive lines don't have a top 10 running attack with the number 2 in yards per attempt, and you don't have terrible offensive lines when you have a team that scores 25 points in half their games.
Well, and that's every conversation we have has always it always has a caveat, and so. One of the things that we've said is if the Cardinals in their ideal offseason, it would set them up to be able to draft a wide receiver at 8. So ideally, that means they get a extension that plays well for both parties with DJ Humphries. They get a 2-year extension with AQ Shipley. They find a veteran, or they re-sign Marcus Gilbert and draft somebody on day 2 or 3 to compete, and back up Justin Murray. But they also really like the kid out of the Army that they signed. That got sick. He got sick, and that kind of messed up his season. And so that's the thing is like. Whether
they
we
actually have some options at right tackle, because you've got Justin Murray. He's going to be back. He's an exclusive rights guy.
And
you've got Marcus Gilbert. Honestly, my son has been preaching this. Is like you could sign him. He's not going to be expensive after everything that's happened the last couple of years. Jordan Mills, who has been a capable right tackle. You've got the young guys in Brett Toth, and even maybe Joshua Miles makes the next step. But they already have kind of in-house
a bunch of guys
you could roll with.
Right, and that's that's been kind of the point that those of us who are talking about a wide receiver have been trying to make. It's not this idea of, they can't improve. You can always improve. I mean, heck, when the Cowboys had the best offensive line in the NFL, they still drafted Connor Williams on day 2, right? And then they moved Lyle Collins to right tackle. They put Connor Williams at left guard. I mean, there's always something you can do. So nobody's saying like, hey, you don't draft an offensive lineman, or don't go sign an offensive lineman. Nobody's saying that. What the conversation is, and where people are struggling, is that the team, if they can bring back the guys that they want to bring back, doesn't see it as big of a need as the public tends to look at it. And so I think from that perspective, that's where a lot of the disconnect comes from, is because people just go, it's the Cardinals, they need offensive line help. And again, you can say that about every team in the NFL. I mean, there's no team in the NFL that you can't say needs help along the offensive line. But I mean, they were the number 2 rushing offense in terms of yards per carry. They were the number 2 rushing offense in Football Outsiders DVOA. They are, a lot of that has to do with scheme. But that's the thing is, when you bring in new players, they have to learn the scheme from scratch. So if you keep this starting 5, you would hope that the only issues you would have in year 2 would be potential injuries. Now, if you want to say you can't trust DJ Humphries to a 5-year $60 million extension. Okay, I'll agree with that. Like, you're not going to hear a whisper of disagreement from me. But, what if they transition tag him? Is a team really going to come in? Because that would mean 2 second-round picks, right? On the transition so is a team really going to come offer 2 second-round picks and then pay DJ Humphries more? I mean, I guess, but then you get 2 second-round picks, so you win some, you lose some, right? I mean, that's the thing is they have options. It's not like they just have to go pay DJ Humphries $17 million a year, or they have to go draft a left tackle or right tackle at 8. What they have to do is they have to execute whatever their plan is. You and I may not agree with the plan. You and I, quite frankly, were not completely sold on the idea of passing over Nick Bosa. I mean, obviously, as soon as it became apparent to us, we were all on board the Kyler train, but you and I definitely were like, we'll see if this works, more than like, heck yeah, they got the guy for the next, 20 years. So at the same time, like, do I think that they could upgrade from at probably 4 positions along the offensive line? Absolutely. I mean, outside of Justin Pugh, I don't know if there's a guy that's not replaceable. And even Pugh, you can make an argument that he hasn't stayed healthy long enough in his career to justify not looking at replacing him. But at the same time, was your offensive line so bad and so detrimental that you couldn't move the ball on offense? No. Okay, and so, you talked about it. They're in the top third. So in the top, we'll call it 10, or was it 11?
They were number 10, so they were in the top 11. So
okay, so they're one of the top 10 teams in terms of holding blocks for 2.5 seconds. What needs to happen in those 2.5 seconds to improve the offense at that point? Well, they need a wide receiver that can get open consistently. And so that's where, chicken egg type thing, if the Cardinals drafted Jedrick Willis, is anybody going to be upset? No, not at all. I think everybody would be fine with that because you're taking a talented player at a position that you can upgrade. Do we think that the team sees the offensive line as this dire need that so many fans have gone into this offseason with? No, and I think that's where the disconnect comes, is that while we may look at it and say, yes, they can definitely upgrade. Well, let's be generous and just say at 3 positions. They can definitely upgrade at 3 positions. We know that that's not their thinking. And so that's where I think the disconnect comes in.
And with that, we will wrap up this show. That'll wrap up this edition, episode 255 of the Rise Up See Red podcast. The best of Cardinals talk on the web. We'll have to take a look at the schedule, what we're going to be doing, because we hit the off season, which slows down our shows a little bit. We'll see how we go in the next couple of weeks, because there's not a lot to talk about unless there's some news that hits. So it might be a couple of weeks before we come back, might be next week. We haven't decided yet, because we kind of build the schedule around off-season needs and free agency and the combine and things like that. On behalf of the show, that's Seth Cox. I'm Jess Root. We'll be back again soon. Thanks for listening as always.
Thanks for listening to the latest edition of the Rise Up See Red podcast. Listen to previous episodes and subscribe to the show on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher Radio, Audioboom, or many other podcast platforms so shows are delivered directly to your mobile device. Please give the show a 5-star rating and always support the sponsors who support the show. We'll be back soon for the best hour of Cardinals talk on the web. Rise up, Red Sea, be Red, See Red, and of course, Rise Up, See Red.